Hi, I'm Jo from J.H.Leather, and in this video I'm going to go over some common issues beginners have with hand stitching and how to avoid them. So through the Discord channel that I run, as well as the community posts I put out here on YouTube, I've got quite a few responses to what issues you guys faced, to the point where I'm actually having to split this into two videos. So this video is going to be focused on some common issues that you are having, and in the next video we're going to look at how to get better at hand stitching and how to get better results. So we are going to start right at the beginning of this process with having issues threading the needle. Now, how I like to look at this is I actually put the needle onto the thread rather than the thread onto the needle. And when we look at it that way and go at the issue from that direction, things can get a bit easier. Now, the first thing what we're going to do is we're going to flatten the end of our thread. So I'm going to put this between my thumb and finger, and using my thumbnail, I'm just going to flatten the end to make it go from a round thread to more of a flat end, which is what is going to be more suitable to actually go through the eye of our needle. And so now the end of our thread is nice and flat, we can put our needle on. Now, I say put the needle on the thread because if you try to put the thread on the needle, then what you'll find is that the end of the thread is just going to flop around and bend out of the way. So we're going to pull that thread really low down between our thumb and forefinger, and I mean really low down. We don't want the end of that thread to be able to flop over whilst we're putting our needle on. Once that is nice and low in your thumb and finger, what you can do is just put the needle onto the thread and just pull that through. And it is as easy as that. Now, it will still take a bit of practice to get the hang of, but by doing it this way, you have much more control over where that thread is going. Now, depending on what thread you use will depend how hard your challenge is here. What I mean by that is that some threads, like linen, are more flexible and tend to flop around a bit more than something like a wax polyester thread. Now, to get around that, if you are using something like a linen thread, what we're going to do is actually coat that in beeswax first, because that's going to give it a protective waterproofing layer, but it's also going to stiffen the thread up a bit and make it so it doesn't flop around as much. Now, another thing to take into account if you are having issues here with threading your needle, and that is the actual needle size. If you are using a really thick piece of thread and trying to get that onto a really tiny needle, that is not going to work. And what you're going to need to do is get a bigger needle, which is going to have a bigger eye so you can easily get the thread through. Another question that you guys were asking was how to work out how much thread to actually use on your projects. Now, I have seen some other leatherworking videos where they encourage you to measure it out, and whilst that's fine if that is what you want to do, for me that is just too much of a faff. So if I'm stitching a short distance, then I'm going to go for a single arm's length of thread. And if I'm going to be doing a long bit of stitching, I'm going to be using a double arm span length of thread. Now, this double arm span is quite important because that is the maximum amount of thread you can use before things start just getting in the way and you end up pulling loads and loads of thread through your leather, which is a little bit unnecessary, and it can also damage the thread. And if you are using a lighter colour thread, it can also get that a bit dirty, which is not what you want. So you are better off at using the double arm span, and when you need to, just start a new thread. So back stitches was something that you guys have asked about a lot on my previous videos, and it did come up quite a few times when I asked the question, what issues were you having when you were getting started with your stitching? Now, the back stitch is incredibly important on things like dog collars or belts, where you're doing your back stitch for that extra strength sort of component to it and cinching that leather in nice and tight around your fitting. Also, being able to do a back stitch means that you can change your threads nice and easily when you are doing long lengths of stitching. Now, what we're going to do if we are starting our stitching is go away from us for 1 or 2 stitches, depending on how many back stitches you are doing. Now, in my videos, I generally tell you how many back stitches to do, so keep an eye out for those when you are watching the make-along videos. And information on those will also be in the pattern packs that are with any of those make-alongs. So what we're going to do is stitch away from ourselves, and then we can stitch forward. Now, to get our threads as nice as possible, we want them to sit next to each other like this, rather than one on top of the other. By having them next to each other like this, they are going to, one, look nicer, but also they're going to sit more flush to the leather. If they were stitched one on top of the other, then the sort of outer stitch can protrude a bit, which is likely to rub more and therefore sort of break or damage over time. So the second stitch of your back stitch is going to naturally want to sit either above or below the first stitch. And we can encourage that by using our needle, a fingernail, the current piece of thread that you're using, or a scratch awl. And we're going to slowly pull that tight, encouraging it to either sit above or below, and then pull that tight. Now, I find the front side of the stitching is the side that needs the encouragement, and the back side generally takes care of itself. And you can see here, I've used two different colours of thread just so you can see what I'm doing here. The green is the back stitches, and you can see as I'm pulling that tight, it is sitting next to the yellow thread, either above or below it, but not on top of it. And the back stitch is what we're going to use when we finish our length of stitching to make sure that those threads are nice and locked in together. Now, unless you are an absolute giant, the likelihood is you are going to need to change your thread when you are stitching a long length of it, either around a belt or doing something like a padded collar or lead, where there is a lot of stitching involved. So now we know how to do our back stitches. What we're going to do is finish our current length of stitching with at least 1.5 back stitches, and we can then finish those off. And then once that's done, we can then start our new length of thread. Now, depending on what it is you are actually stitching, you can just start straight away without having to do a back stitch. And this is what I would be using if I was doing sort of decorative stitching or something like on a dog collar where I'm stitching the padding, because that doesn't require a strength element to it. And what you can do is just start stitching and continue on as you were. Now, if you are making a bag, let's say, and you want that strength element because you need your stitches nice and tight, we can do at least one back stitch. So what we're going to do is we're going to start one hop forward from where we finished our length of stitching, go back towards the stitching that we just finished so that all our stitch holes and our stitches will line up and there's not going to be a gap. And then we're going to continue on stitching as we were, making sure that back stitch has the threads sitting side by side and not one on top of the other. Now, as with leather, threads come in all sorts of varieties, and some of them have a nasty habit of twisting up on themselves whilst you're stitching. Now, what we can do to help ourselves if we have a thread that likes to do this is, before we even start stitching, cut your length of thread and then hold it at one end, and with your other hand you're going to run your fingers over it and it's going to untwist. And we're going to do that 5 or 6 times so that the twist that is in the thread is going to become more relaxed and it's less likely to twist up on itself when you're actually stitching. So now you've done that, you can get stitching, and by doing this method before you start, that's really going to help this thread from twisting up on itself when you get stitching. However, if it does happen while stitching, what you can do is put it between your fingers once more and run your fingers along it from the leather end towards the needle, and that's just going to untwist itself and then you can carry on. Now, one of the most common issues that beginners have when doing their hand stitching is accidentally stitching through the thread. So there are a couple of things we can do here. Now, if you haven't realised that you've stitched through the thread and you have pulled your needles through, what we want to do is remove the offending needle from the thread and then pull that back through, and it's going to come out easily and go through that bit of the thread, and it's not going to cause any more tangles or knots. And then what you can do is just run that area where the needle did go through the thread through your fingers just to smooth the fibres down, and then you can put your needle back on and continue stitching. Now, the way I actually get around not stitching through my thread is in my actual hand stitching technique. Now, if you have seen my beginner guide to hand stitching, which I will link at the end of this video as well as in the description, just for you to check back in on if you need to, is on my stitches, I will actually pull my thread on my left hand side before I pull the needle through. Now the reason for that is because if I have accidentally stitched through the thread, it's really to tell at this point, because your thread is not going to actually pull through. And if it does, it's going to bring the needle with it. And at that point, we can just pull the needle back out a bit so it's not through the thread and then carry on. Now, if you haven't stitched through it, then that thread is going to run through nicely and you're not going to have any issues, and you can then do your cast and carry on. And you can see that I do that through all of my stitching in all of my videos. Now, if you are using something like a linen thread and you accidentally stitch through the thread, what I tend to do is add some more beeswax at this point and then smooth that over the area as well. And that's just going to make sure those fibres are nice and smoothed down and the needle's not likely to go through it again. If you are enjoying this video and would like to learn how to create more leathercraft projects, then I have a whole range of printable PDF pattern packs and durable acrylic templates available for you to purchase via my website jhleather.co.uk, or you can head to the links in the description. So when starting out in crafting, I do see a lot of beginners using a thread that is either too thick or too thin for their chosen stitch mark size. So you want to strike a balance between your chosen stitch mark size and the size of your thread that you are using. Now, if your thread is too thick for your chosen stitch markers, your stitches are going to look quite flat, and also they're going to be quite sort of bobbled, for lack of a better term, because the thread is so thick in those small holes. Now, if you use a thread that is way too thin for your chosen stitch marks, it's just going to look a bit weird because those stitch marks are going to be so dominant as the thread isn't going to fill them. And that is going to transfer to the back side of your stitching as well, with the back looking a bit weird just because that thread is so thin in those stitch marks. Now, like I said, you want to strike a balance between your chosen stitch mark and your thread size. Now for me, my preferred setup is a 3.38mm pricking iron paired with a 0.55mm thread, or a 0.45mm thread if I am stitching on sort of thinner leather, for example in a wallet. Now in my Leathercraft 101 series that I did a while ago, there is a whole video dedicated to thread, needles and stitching size, which I'll again link at the end of the video and in the description, and you can go and check that out if you want a bit more information. Another issue I see with beginner crafters is with the tension on your threads when you're stitching. Now for the most part, what I see is that they are not pulled tight enough. Now this leaves them sort of protruding off the edges of your leather, which is going to leave them sort of vulnerable to getting damaged because they're going to get rubbed more easily. And also, if you're not pulling tight enough, they sort of look a bit bobbled and just not ideal. So on this test piece that I have here, you can see the difference between the stitches that have been stitched tight enough and the ones that are still quite loose. And you can actually hear the difference when I rub my scratch all over them. So what we want is to pull our threads tight enough so they just cinch in the leather when we pull them. So what you can do when starting out is to loosely get them where you need them to be, and then just pull tight, and you should be able to see the leather just cinch in around those stitches, and that is where you want to leave it. Because if you go the other way and pull them too tight, you run the risk of actually pulling the thread through the leather, which again is not ideal. And if you are using a softer, sort of thinner piece of leather, what this can actually do is make your stitches bunch up, and it's going to sort of make the edge of your leather banana, for lack of a better term, and it's going to sort of sit up at the ends because the tension within those threads is just so tight. So again, with the threads, what you want is to just pull them loosely so that they sit on the leather, and then just a little bit further, and you can just see the leather just cinch in, and that is what we are after. Now when it comes to finishing the ends of your thread, this is going to depend entirely on what thread you have used. If you have used a man-made thread, like a wax polyester, what we can do is use heat to melt the ends of that thread. However, if you are using a linen thread, if you try to melt the ends, well, you're just going to end up burning it. So we're not going to want to do that, and we're actually going to use some glue. Now, what I do is if I am using a waxed polyester thread, so a man-made thread, I'm going to cut that with a little bit of excess off, and then I can use either a lighter or a thread zapper to just get the ends of those threads sort of melted and now flush with the leather. Now, if you are using the thread zapper, you want to be very careful here that you don't touch your leather or accidentally touch another stitch and melt that, because that's not going to be ideal. What we want to do is very carefully just touch the ends of the thread with that zapper so they melt and they'll get level with the rest of our stitches. Now, if you are using linen thread, what I generally do is cut that really quite close to my leather, and then what I'm going to do is apply some glue to the end of those threads with the use of a scratchel, or you can use a needle. And the glue that I'm using here is just my general leather glue that I use here in the workshop, or you can use a PVA glue. Now, sometimes when you are stitching, you can end up with an odd looking stitch. And what I mean by that is that it either sits up too high or too low compared to your other stitches and just looks odd, and it stands out amongst the rest of your stitches. Then the likelihood is it's just that the threads have got a bit weirdly caught inside the leather. Now, hopefully we're going to see this early on in our stitch line so we can actually unstitch this and do something about it. So we're going to remove the needles, and then we're going to unstitch so we're one stitch further back than the issue stitch, and then we're just going to put our needles back on and stitch towards us as normal. By restitching it, you can keep an eye on it and make sure you don't get that weird dropped stitch. So hopefully that answered most of your questions about your hand stitching issues. Now, remember to subscribe to the channel if you want to be notified when the next video comes out, which is going to be all about how to get better at hand stitching.